Hello, everybody has bad writing to fix, I see. Well, we're going to get started. I just want to say I am stoked. I've never been stoked before. I am stoked to be introducing this morning's meeting and our presenter. I struggle with a never-ending whack-a-mole that is trying to keep up with the writing required at our firm. And I feel like no matter how much of it I do, there's always more I wish I could get my eyes on. And honestly, there's always more that I can learn about how to actually write truly in a truly effective way. And I know I'm not alone, not only because of how many folks are joining us this morning, but because year over year, our committee's internal survey turns up writing as a hot topic for our members. So I suspect that many of y'all are looking for a refresh and perhaps some pointers to bring back to your cellar doers today too. When Marcia and I thought about where to go for help, for both of us, Mike Plotnick's name came up, so we knew we had a winner. So without further ado, let me introduce Mike. Mike Plotnick helps businesses discover, build, and share their stories. He leads the communication firm Plotlines, and they draw together disciplines of writing, public relations, marketing, branding, and social networking. And they work with their clients on everything from, writing and editing to article placement and media relations to content strategies aimed at engaging entirely new audiences. And Mike does this work based out of St. Louis, where I understand they already are getting their snow today. But Mike works with AEC clients from across the country, including some names that will be familiar in this group: HOK, IA, Interior Architects, PGAL, Tylin, Knoll, and Building Design and Construction Magazine, just to name a few. So Mike, thank you so much for joining us this morning to help us write our writing.
My pleasure. It is good to be with all of you. What Kate did not share in her introduction is that I hail from Boston. I was born in Framingham, and my family lived there for the first few years of my life until my dad was transferred to New York and then to Ohio. And I'm currently in St. Louis, so I'm gradually making my way westward. And so I think my next stop is probably Denver or Salt Lake City. So we'll have to see. But I'm thrilled to be with you this morning, to come home to Boston, even if it's via Zoom and not in person. So thank you for joining me. I'm thrilled to see a large crowd. I will share my screen and we'll get started.
Ooh, and I will interrupt you immediately to say that we have a lot of folks in the room. So what we'd like to do is, as we go through the presentation, share your questions in the chat. Marcia Miller and I will monitor the chat and try to be quick to fit them in when it makes sense. And I think that'll help us keep things moving slowly, but don't save them to the end, just throw them in chat when you have them. Okay, Mike, go.
All right. Thanks again for joining me. I assume that all of you in some way, shape, or form are engaged in writing at your firms, or are burdened with writing perhaps, and at times are frustrated by writing. I certainly can feel that pain. Even though I'm primarily a writer, there are days that I say, do I really have to crank out another article? So it's not unusual even for professional writers to be challenged by writing. So one of my favorite writing sayings is, I don't like writing, I like having written. In other words, it's grueling to go through the writing process sometimes, but at the other side of the writing, when it's completed and it's published, perhaps it's a great fulfillment sometimes to go back and say, I'm proud of that. That's pretty good, or at least thank God that's over. So anyway, hopefully I will give you some insights and advice that you'll be able to put into action at your firms. So I thought I would start with a few disclaimers that writing is subjective. It's more art than science, so I'm not necessarily the be-all, end-all writing guru. You may disagree with what I suggest, and that's fine. But the English language continues to evolve as we all are living through, and certainly business communications continues to get more casual. Although in the proposal world, it still seems somewhat static and at times antiquated, but it will gradually continue to get more casual and conversational, I believe. I do believe that grammar still matters. And I also believe it's okay to break the rules occasionally. Advertisers do this all the time. You know, a single word and a period, which of course is not a full sentence, but can add emphasis or impact. I remember Apple many years ago had the slogan, think different. And I would constantly say, it's think differently, which of course their ad agency is probably well aware of, but they did it for impact, not for to be grammatically correct. So that said, I also want to convey that I understand as marketers what your plight is. I understand your challenges. I've seen it and experienced it from the inside of a firm. I was at HOK for about 10 years as director of PR. And I see it now from the outside, working with and consulting with several AEC firms. I understand you're frequently overworked, you're understaffed. You probably don't have a pool of writers you can bring in to help. You tend to go from deadline to deadline, often at the 11th hour, maybe waiting for narratives that some subject matter expert had promised and continues to not deliver. You often have too many cooks in the kitchen, that you may have multiple bosses or people who want to be in control of a proposal process or an award submittal, and you're trying to appease and satisfy all of them at once, which is not an easy task.
Mike, you're about to have a group cry on your hand. This is hitting a little close to home.
And some things are beyond your control as a result. I say all of this not to bring you down, but to let you know that I understand that even if you agree with everything I share, and you may not be able to implement it immediately, but I do believe you can start to move in that direction to weave some of these techniques and tips into your own writing and into your firm's writing, or at least propose them. So I think there'll be practical ways you can start to move in that direction. With all that as a preamble, I am going to launch into the meat of the presentation, which is at the front end of every writing project, and actually throughout a writing project. I think it's important to keep two things in mind. Two principles. The first is, who is the audience? And as marketers, this probably comes naturally for every marketing initiative. It can be challenging, though, as you probably all know, with proposals and things. You're not exactly sure who's on the selection committee. You're not exactly sure who's the decision maker. But the fact is, the more precisely you can define who you're trying to reach, the better you can convey and reach them and connect with them and resonate with them. So the more due diligence you can do in terms of, is this proposal or piece going to reach a board of education of a progressive school district, or the CEO of a defense contractor, or the curator of an art museum? And these are very, very different people with different mindsets, probably hire architects and engineers for different reasons and use different selection criteria. So I recognize that a lot of times you have a multi-dimensional, multifaceted audience, but the more you can hone in on who exactly is most important and how we convey to them, the better you will be. And the old kind of adage, if you try to write for everyone, you're essentially writing for no one. The next one is, this is painful for me to admit, but most people are not going to read everything that you write. So that is painful for me, who spends sometimes hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks crafting a finely honed narrative, and then recognizing, well, the majority of people are not reading this. They're probably not reading your 100-page proposal cover to cover, having to review multiple others at the same time. That doesn't mean it's not important to have very buttoned up, compelling text, but you've got to use, as you probably well know, as designers and proposal generators, pulling them into the text through entry points, photo captions, pull out quotes, refinements of the text, things like that. But we certainly are living in an increasing world of skimmers and scanners. Skimmers, will go through maybe it's sort of as a speed reader, and scanners will just basically give the most cursory view, looking for something that jumps out at them to see if they're interested in reading further. So all that to say, I have identified 5 common writing pitfalls that I've noticed and observed within the AEC world. There were probably more, but I've kind of boiled it down into 5. So I'm going to list them, and then we're going to go into each one with a little bit more detail. First one, these are not necessarily in order of importance, but I'm starting with sort of the nuts and bolts, incorrect grammar and mechanics, and I include typos in that. You know, typos happen. We all experience them. They're not pleasant. They certainly happen for the most part, I think, because, you know, you're in too much of a hurry and don't have the opportunity to maybe kind of root them out. But what does this say to your clients or potential partners? That you're careless, that your firm is maybe not detail oriented. These are things that are not helpful for conveying for someone who's potentially going to hire you to design a $300 million building. The second pitfall that I noticed is narratives are poorly organized. So what does this say? This is confusing. You know, you're not helping people understand exactly what they're supposed to come away with. The third pitfall, sweeping generalities, which makes your text abstract. The fourth pitfall, redundancies and fluff. This is something that typically, I believe, happens when you're trying to essentially stretch, when you don't have enough to write about and you're trying to, you know, kind of fill a field, or, you know, kind of, they're asking for up to 500 words and you've got 200. But this just makes your text cumbersome. And the final is inconsistencies. Again, this is, you know, I think in a large part driven by your rush in pulling everything together and meeting a deadline, but it makes the text disjointed. So let's go one by one through each of these in a little more detail, and I'm going to provide a few examples. So a little bit of a grammar lesson. We don't need to go too deep in this, and some of you are probably breaking out in a cold sweat, but this is something that you probably learned in middle school or junior high. You know, I used to diagram sentences, which was fun, and I don't know if they still do that, but it was helpful in terms of this is the most simple sentence structure. A subject, a predicate, an object, noun, verb, noun. And if we plug in words, Ben designed the building. It's most simple, straightforward. If we wrote every sentence like this, it would be repetitive and dull and, you know, not effective. But I think we've gone in many respects way to the nth degree where we've got convoluted clauses, we've got, you know, 14 commas, we've got sentences that go on for miles. So I am a strong advocate for getting more back to the simple sentence structure, you know, and then kind of weaving in more complex sentences, different sentence lengths, you know, use different techniques to keep people engaged and the narrative flowing. Here are my pieces of advice on improving your grammar and mechanics. Use the active voice in large part versus the passive voice. The active voice is, this is probably a reminder for those, I learned this in high school composition class. The active voice is the subject does the action versus the object doing the action. We're going to talk a little bit later in the presentation with some examples so I can show this in action, but it just makes the text crisper. It's typically shorter, it's more direct. One idea per sentence. I constantly see people kind of trying to cram way too much into one sentence. And the rule is one idea per sentence with rare exceptions. The third piece is show, don't tell. You know, this is kind of like, even though you've got imagery and photos and wonderful projects, you know, the goal is to show through your text as well, through descriptive phrases, through action verbs, through colorful other ways of conveying kind of what you're trying to say. I mean, novelists do this all the time, good ones. They don't have any imagery whatsoever, yet they're painting a picture that you can then envision in your head. And the final point is adjectives which modify nouns are important. You know, the beautiful house, you know, the distinctive furniture setting, whatever it might be, that those are important. I don't think they should be overused. They certainly sometimes are. And then adverbs, which modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs, I would use them almost never. They tend to be words that end in LY, the beautifully simple floor versus just the simple floor. They tend to just make things overly complicated. There's also sort of like the nearly completed building. You know, it hedges your bets, it makes it imprecise. Stephen King talks about never using adverbs in any of his novels because it's wimpy writing. And here is an example taken from I think it was a brochure from an engineering firm. At project initiation, firm focuses on determining the extent and level of services required during design and construction by the designer, contractors, and owner to achieve total building commissioning, as the commissioning agent is responsible for the implementation of the total building commissioning process. So talk about a mouthful. I think that's 44 words. That's a single sentence. This could be broken in, it actually could be consolidated greatly and perhaps broken into 2 sentences. And we've got some punctuation issues. There should be a comma after at project initiation. It's incorrect use of a semicolon because this isn't a full sentence. But anyway, just to give you a sense of, this is something that even more, the most important part of this, I think, is it's way too much of a mouthful, particularly for a single sentence. Okay, the second pitfall is that it's poorly organized. And I've kind of outlined 3 primary narrative structures. There are probably more, but I'll boil it down to 3. The first being linear, which is a logical sequential flow. This is something that engineers do automatically. Certainly project managers, I mean, their whole job is built around following a job from beginning through every phase. So they see the world in a linear fashion and they write in a linear fashion. Now, linear narratives are occasionally good for technical papers, for things that need to show a process from beginning to end. They're not the most engaging narratives to write or to read, so I use them in limited ways. The second narrative structure is inverted pyramid. This is what I learned in journalism school, which is basically put the most important thing up top in the first sentence, in the first paragraph. So, and the theory is, and it's true, you know, if someone's only going to read one paragraph, you want them to get the gist of the story. What you want them to come away with needs to be up top, whether it happened on day 1 or day 72. So I'm going to show examples of each of these in a moment. And the third is the story, sort of something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Not that it tells it, it typically doesn't tell it in a sequential logical way, but it has a narrative beginning, a middle, and an end. It typically conveys emotion. It typically weaves in people, perspectives. It's either told from a personal perspective or it weaves in quotes. This is, you know, in my estimation, of course, I've built my business around it, is the most powerful narrative structure. And I think there's certainly opportunities to weave in story elements to almost all of your writing. Even if you're asked in a proposal, you know, tell me about your quality process. You know, it may not make necessarily sense to tell it in a story, but you can probably weave in story elements to make it a little bit more interesting than just a very flat, dry narrative. So here's just an example. I'm not going to read it, but this is a linear. It's sort of, I think it's from an award submittal. It's basically tells something from, you know, from the early parts of a project through different phases. So that's linear. Give me a moment to read. Nothing too exciting, but it definitely kind of conveys kind of what happened when. Okay, inverted pyramid. This is from a press release, and press releases are, and sort of journalistic copy, sometimes on proposals and even in websites, I think inverted pyramid works. You know, this is everything of importance to this particular firm, who's not mentioned, comes up at top. Basically, we want people to know that they hosted this softball tournament. They raised a lot of money for charities and engaged a lot of local firms. If you'll notice, nowhere does it say who the winner of the tournament was. Now that's included, but it's the next paragraph. because for this firm, so it's great that Goody Clancy got, won this softball tournament, but to us, it's more important that we hosted the tournament because, if it appeared in the newspaper, though, they might say, Goody Clancy won the 22nd annual tournament hosted by XYZ firm. So that's inverted pyramid. And then finally, story. This is just an example of, it's still a technical topic about a lean construction process, but it's told in more of a story format. And following these 3 paragraphs, quotes are woven in from various team members and subcontractors. And so it's just a more engaging way of telling this kind of a story than just by telling it in a very dry, flat, kind of methodical way. So those are the 3 kind of major narrative structures. Next, pitfall. I think we're pitfall number 3 is sweeping generalities. I've just listed a few examples on the left of, sort of the general term, and then how you might make it a little bit more descriptive. Rather than an entryway, we're talking about a domed rotunda. Rather than a challenging site, we're talking about a 12-acre urban brownfield. Now, I will say you can go to the nth degree, and certainly, it happens with engineers and others where they're giving way too many details. So you have to sort of ratchet it back because, most people would glaze over if you went into too much detail. But when you get so general that you really aren't kind of conveying anything, I think it's important to include some level of detail. Here's an example of a very general statement. This is from an architecture firm's proposal, one of them. We will pull together experts within our firm at key intervals to create a design council that will offer the best expert solutions to achieve the highest value. Okay, my question is, okay, which experts? When are you going to pull them together? What's a design council? What do you mean by expert solutions? And what does it mean to achieve the highest value? Essentially, you're not telling me anything. So even when you have a short, not many words, I think you can do a better job of being a little bit more specific about what you're talking about. And not just giving these just glaring, just overarching generalities. Next is redundancies and fluff. Here again are some examples of, on the left, sort of like the more cumbersome statement, and then more simple and direct statement on the right. We could do this for probably days with examples of how things are overwritten and over-described and could be consolidated. I am, just an anecdote, I sometimes write freelance articles for industry publications, and most magazines, or many magazines, still pay by the word. So, you make 100 or $1 per word or whatever it is. So, which I think is, sort of a ridiculous way to determine the value of writing, because as I think Winston Churchill said, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. And it's very true, it's harder to write shorter than it is longer. And the longer I spend with a piece of writing, inevitably, it'll get shorter. So I feel like I'm getting penalized for being a better writer. So it's sort of like, okay, what used to be a 500-word article is now a 300-word article. And so I'm going to get paid less for doing a more thorough job. So anyway, it is what it is. But essentially, I'm always for tightening where at all possible. And I will also say, I doubt highly that any of your firms have been eliminated from contention because your proposal didn't have enough words. So you don't need to fill out completely to the max. When they ask for 500 words max, you don't have to submit 498. It's okay to submit 298 if that's essentially conveying what they're asking in the most concise, compelling way. So here's an example. This is from a website, actually. Together, we want to be a force for real innovation. We want to help solve problems and transform lives. Together, we are entrepreneurs who are empowered to drive real change. We are creators who believe that place and space matters, and that what we build together drives the growth of cities, not to mention the world's next generation of great thinkers and doers that live there. Okay. Well, this to me, I think what they're trying to do is this big kind of, we're helping to drive the industry forward and be kind of all together and convey all this collaboration. And I think they don't quite succeed in my estimation. You know, there's a lot of redundancies in this. The last line, it should be great thinkers and doers who live there, not that live there. So that's a nitpick on the grammar side. But I just think that this, you know, they didn't achieve what they were trying to achieve in terms of, you know, you're not really telling me anything. You're trying to get me all worked up and not giving me any details.
Hey, Mike, I got a couple of questions for you.
Yep.
And you can say whether now is a good time or whether you want to save it for later. Maybe you're going to address some of these later. First of all, though, I live in terror that I'm going to see one of my firm's paragraphs up here because we could have been guilty of any of these. The first one has to do with jargon. Do you have any suggestion about, I mean, could this maybe be a common pitfall? Karen Whitney raises this. We know architects have a thriving culture of jargon.
Absolutely. And my position on jargon, and I meant to say it earlier, actually, it's about your audience. So if your audience wants and even expects jargon, I say give them jargon. But when your audience doesn't understand what jargon is and doesn't want to talk about jargon, you know, so it's a judgment call often. But in a technical paper, it should have jargon. If you're putting an AIA honor award, yes, include jargon, because you have to assume that the jury is going to be inside the beltway, so to speak, in terms of understanding, you know, how architects talk and work. And, you know, but if you're talking to more general audience, I think jargon is a problem. You know, it's something that needs to be minimized and or explained. So I hope that answers.
There was another set of questions which I feel like pair together. Lindsay King was asking, you know, she'd love input on how to take a boring scope of work where you have to go through all 200 tasks one by one, and whether there's a way to give that story flair. And then Deb Kane weighed in asking about any suggestions on the balance of storytelling, narrative versus bullet points.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of bullet points. I think they make sense in limited fashion, but when there are 17 bullet points, it's like nobody is going to read those bullet points. You know, maybe I would limit it. I mean, this is just off the top of my head, to 5 or fewer bullet points if you're going to use them, and use them sporadically. Don't use every single narrative text block is followed by 15 bullet points. It's like that is it's way too repetitive. People are not, you know, you're essentially checking it off your list in terms of, oh, we covered all this stuff, but people are probably not reading it. So I say limited use of bullet points. I know it is, you know, kind of easy to kind of boil things down to bullet points, and they do make sense in certain instances. And remind me, Kate, what was the first question?
The first one was about how to take a boring scope of work where you have to go through all 200 tasks in a project one by one, and whether there's a way to give that story flair. And I thought you were going to say bullet it out. So you're shocking me, Mike.
No, I don't. You know, I think there are ways, and sometimes you have to again, it goes to the audience and it goes to what's expected. So perhaps, you know, even though it makes for more interesting copy, sometimes the scope of work should be dry. It should be kind of direct and kind of linear and dry to a certain extent. Again, it depends who the audience is, and it depends what they're expecting. And I know this is going to, again, require some judgment calls. You don't quite know, you're not interviewing them, but you're kind of making some educated guesses in terms of what are they expecting. And if you want to kind of stand out, there are always ways to, I think, weave in some very kind of subtle story elements. So you're telling things in a slightly less dry way. You're perhaps incorporating, when it makes sense, a quote from someone or some kind of an anecdote that makes it a little less, you know, kind of methodical. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Great.
But then Deb goes on to say, not to be contrary, but if people are scanning and skimming copy more, aren't bullet points easier to read?
Well, again, in a limited way, yes, but 11 of them in a row are not gonna, I don't read 11 bullets. I might read up to 5, and I might read them sporadically. I think in some ways, and I'm guilty of this, so I'm not casting any kind of aspersions, but it's a lazy way of writing sometimes because you don't have the time or the interest in really crafting a narrative. You just kind of boom, 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 boom. And again, in limited ways, at certain times, that is the most effective way. But I would push back that in many cases, it is not. Any other questions before we move on?
There's another question about outline format, Roman numerals A, B versus 1, 2, etc.
Yeah, I don't feel strongly about that in terms of formatting. I don't do a whole lot of outlines myself. Sometimes I'm required to do them for, before I submit or develop an article to outline it. But I'm probably not the best expert on terms of what the best format is for those outlines. I think there probably is a standard format. And I think like everything else, it probably has been relaxed over the years. And now there probably isn't really a standard and people do it in different ways. And, so there's probably not an ideal solution for every case.
Does that answer your question, Holly, or were you actually asking about using call outs like that? Okay. Sorry. Holly's clarifying in real time in the chat. You feel free to shout it out, Holly. She said that her question is, do you think outlining is effective?
In terms of using an outline in a final document, or using an outline to help organize your thoughts?
Final document.
Yeah, and for most, no. I mean, maybe it is for, if you're talking, a project team is communicating among itself, but in terms of for a potential client, in the most cases, I would say no.
Good.
But that's my opinion. All right, we ready to move on?
Yes.
Okay, here are my recommendations on reducing and eliminating redundancies in fluff. The first is treat writing and editing as separate functions. I think they use different parts of our brains. I will tell you, and I think probably any writer will tell you, the magic happens in the editing. You would be horrified to read some of my first drafts. You would say, how in the world does anyone hire you to write anything? I mean, they're horrible. But you got to start somewhere, and the editing is really where it gets shaped into something that is readable and effective. So the ability, and again, this takes time. I recognize you don't necessarily have the time to put it away and look at tomorrow and then the next day, but to the extent you can separate the sort of like general writing with the editing, that is helpful. Trim, which we talked about previously. I mean, always go through and try to trim the fat. Read it aloud is helpful either to yourself or to a colleague. If you're running out of breath, turning blue in the face, and your eyes are rolling back in your head, it's probably too long of a sentence. It probably needs to be broken up into 2 sentences or 3 sentences, or kind of consolidated. And enlist at least one fresh pair of eyes, not just any eyes, but eagle eyes. Someone who's going to point out all the details. It doesn't necessarily need to be a writer, but maybe someone who's just a detail hound and just can say, can point out all the meticulous things you may have missed. I think that's helpful. Again, it does require additional time, but I think it's time well spent when you have it. Okay, and the final kind of pitfall, and it's probably the least significant in my mind, is just the inconsistencies. You've got a hodgepodge of writing styles, which of course reflects the too many cooks in the kitchen syndrome. You've got shifting points of view where you're talking maybe in first person and third person, which I think is okay to go back and forth between we and our and the firm name. That makes it conversational, but then you weave in the second person you, where you're talking directly to a client or a reader, and it's just sort of, that is very jarring, and it happens all the time. Seemingly contradictory statements, where in one part of a document it says you have 6 offices, and then elsewhere it says you have 8. Clearly you've been probably piecing together parts from various eras of the firm or various proposals, and and no one has basically made sure everything agreed and aligned. And then the inconsistent references, lots of back to the jargon and just the nomenclature within the industry. How are you referring to this? How are you punctuating things? How are you using capitalization? Those kinds of things. Most people who read will not necessarily identify or notice this. I notice a lot of this. So my recommendations on this front are to create a simple style guide to specify how your firm's going to reference common AEC terms in all your materials. This would include rules about capitalization, abbreviations, punctuation. This wouldn't be, there are style guides. There's the AP style guide, the Chicago Manual of Style, that just kind of are more voluminous in terms of the entire English language. Honing in, though, I think on AEC terms can be helpful because you're using them over and over and over, which means they're probably appearing in multiple places of a proposal or an article, and they, in many cases, don't match. And once again, enlist an objective editor to synthesize your draft into a cohesive, consistent narrative. So those are my recommendations. Now, the next, and I think final, no, it's not the final, but one of the final samples or examples I would like to share. Before I bring it up, I want to give you a little bit of a backstory. This is a well-regarded, well-respected architecture design firm nationally. I don't think they have any New England offices, but I'm sure some of you have competed against them for project work. And I think on social media, I saw that they had launched a new website. I'm like, oh, I want to check out the new website. I think I knew the company that had designed it. So I went to check it out. I went first to the About section, which is where I tend to start to say, okay, how are you positioning yourself? What are you talking about? What do you kind of, what's significant from your perspective to convey? And I was shocked, I tell you, at what I discovered. And I will unveil it. I'm not going to read it. It is fairly long, but I'd like each of you to read it. And I'd like to sort of open the discussion. I'd like some of your perspectives of what you think about this narrative that I'm about to share. And my personal belief is I think it breaks pretty much every one of or that falls into every single one of the pitfalls that we just talked about. But I would love your perspective on, viewing this fresh. So here is the narrative. Here it appeared on their website just as this in one block with no paragraphs, no formatting, anything. This was just the statement. I'm not sure if it's still there, but it was. So anyway, take a moment to read this, and then I'd like to just, Kate, maybe your help in opening the floor, and I'd like some feedback on what you think of this statement.
I suggest if folks have a comment, maybe they can raise their hand using the reaction tool, and then we can call on names rather than have folks shout it out.
Great. And you're free to say you love it. You don't have to agree with me. I'm just curious how it hits you, kind of. At first blush.
Made me feel better.
Okay, Karen Whitney, you're up.
Hi, thank you so much for this exercise. Just quickly, it feels like a word salad with just a lot of sentences strung together that don't really relate. And I'm really not sure what I'm supposed to take away from it. And the very first sentence is just like, customer service is just not very exciting. It feels like I'm being pandered to. So those are just my thoughts.
Yeah, I would agree on every count. I'm with you, Karen. And it's interesting with the great customer service. I mean, again, they could be Walmart. I don't know that any AEC firm talks about customer service, maybe client service, which makes it a little bit more kind of, it's like, who talks about customers? Anyway, I agree. Any other, I'd love to hear other perspectives, whatever it may be, how this hits you, what your thoughts are.
A lot of comments in the chat. So if you've thrown a comment in the chat, feel free to shout it out.
Well, Deb, you had your hand up, didn't you?
Oh, my comment was, first of all, it does look a lot like the descriptions of a lot of AEC firms I know. So it's like, oh, so what's unique about this firm? But I think that's the biggest thing is, what is their unique selling point? What is it that makes them different from every other architecture firm? Because I know that's something that we try really hard to work on. And this sounds like it's trying to be everything to everyone.
Mm.
And Lindsay?
I was just going to say, I think this is definitely an example of too many cooks in the kitchen. I can just imagine how some, basically people say, oh, you need to say this and you need to say that. And there's a marketer probably at the center or some web developers trying to weave all of this together in a cohesive manner. And I think that they weren't able to do that. Lindsay, I think you had raised your hand.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the overall organization of it too. It's not really building to anything. It's kind of all over the place. You start out with this customer service, and then we don't even know what you're driving towards. Like, what's the point? What do you really want us to take away from this? And like halfway through, I stopped reading because I started to glaze over. So even just the overall organization of it, beyond the sentence level, is really not working for them.
Totally agree. Not to bash this firm. Thankfully, I'm not disclosing their name. Maybe I could be bought if you really want to know who it is. But kidding. But it's also interesting. Again, I said this, but it's like this is one block of copy. They didn't even try to break it out into paragraphs. They didn't even try to bold something. They didn't. I mean, it's like it's plopped it down.
Carrie Ann had a comment too.
Good morning. Yeah, I was thinking it does look to me like it was written by a principal or somebody after a strategy session, and it did not get an actual edit. I think Mike's being generous saying some marketing person tried to make this work, but either they got overridden or there wasn't anybody to edit it. And just the structure of the sentences is so disjointed. Some are super long, some are really short. They don't really tie together. I think the first comment was kind of, word salad. There's just no flow to tell me, what I really need to know. And I think the intent, we can all probably get the intent out of this. And with like a half hour of copy editing, we can have a really strong paragraph that tells clients what they need to know. But it's there in various phrases, but also it seems a little jargony, with phrases like empower and user experience and all of those things that, might be great sounding to somebody in leadership, but not necessarily mean anything to a reader.
Right. Agreed. Any other final thoughts or perspectives? Okay,
I feel like this is just such a common thing in our industry. And like, I don't know when this happened. Like, it wasn't always like this, but like within the last 5 years, I feel like I see this everywhere. Just this like such big general like ideas. And I don't know if like people are trying to take brands like Nike and Apple and that kind of thing that are so well known and that are doing this kind of like empowering speech because they can get away with it because they're Apple and Nike, and trying to, portray it in our industry where, not everybody knows who all of our firms are, and we need to be a little more concise with our language. So I guess like my stance is, yeah, this is not good, but it's so common. And like, how do we, I guess my question is, how do we present ourselves in a way that's competitive when and feels like well, at the same time is representing ourselves well without using this kind of language when like so many other companies are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Jacqueline, you're kind of echoing something that Elizabeth said in the chat as well, that her question was, what would you do to make this more specific and meaningful? Because the broad and generic and sweeping is not helping in terms of differentiation.
Right. But at the same time, like, how do you do that for your firm when other firms are using this kind of language? And this seems to be like the quote unquote popular thing to do. You know what I mean? So how are you still competitive when others are trying to have this really general, broad, like powerful, even though it's really not, kind of language?
Yeah, I personally believe, as I've said before, less is more. I agree with you. Sometimes you could put, kind of about sections in a hat and throw it up in the air and one comes out and they sort of all sound the same. So understanding what your firm's unique kind of special sauce or unique selling proposition is and conveying that. And you can't be everything to everyone. And I think this tries to basically talk to everyone, goes back to my audience thing. Okay, even though a website can be accessed by anyone on the internet, you certainly have primary audiences or should have primary targets and secondary targets. Are you trying to achieve or attract new clients? Are you trying to attract new employees? Which one's more important? How are you going to reach them? And both in language and in design and formatting and that kind of thing. So I think everything in my mind goes back to audience. So before I just included some, the red statements I think are, either could be deleted. They essentially restate or try to, basically repeat the statement before. The last one, this is an example at the end, we're talking, everything else is in talking about us and the firm. And then at the end, we say, we elevate the process space for the user and the impact of design on your business. So it's like, we're talking directly to a client. The 95% of the text talks without including your, and then the last statement we're talking about. So it's, to me, it's jarring and it's sort of like, okay, it's not consistent and it's really not effective. So what do you really think? I just think I wanted to share this just because I think it was a good example of basically committing every offense that I had outlined. And so I thought it was helpful. So for my final kind of summary, I would like to share, and I'd like to invite each of you to start weaving in 3 different opportunities for how you can put this into practice in your own firms, and recognizing that you're not going to be able to implement all of this all at once, but you can start somewhere and you may wonder where. And these are my 3 suggestions. Number 1, you may not be surprised, is simplify. I love this article from Harvard Business Review in October, which kind of third-party endorsement that simple writing is more effective writing. This particular study, I think, is talking about investors, but I think it probably, I would guess, holds true for every audience. It's like, unless you're reading a novel, short and simple is going to be more effective. And this reinforces that. The second kind of way you can immediately kind of start to improve your writing is to be more active. And this is, I use an application called Power Thesaurus. It's open on my computer constantly on a window. It's a free app, and it basically, you can search in a lot of different ways for different words meaning the same thing. I'm constantly looking for it, and inevitably it's about verbs, active verbs, because verbs really do all the work in the sentence. If you've got bad verbs, you've got a bad sentence in my mind. So I'm always looking for active verbs that are unique, that are specific. And so using more active verbs and not the same ones. And then let's talk a little bit about passive and active voice. This is an example of passive voice. Again, the object is doing the action versus the subject. So this is the red segments obviously are the sort of the active statements. Everything was used, were developed, were placed, was able. It's long, it's cumbersome, it's wimpy. And I will say, most engineers write like this. My experience with the engineers I've worked with, they all write in passive voice, and I'm constantly changing it. That's just my experience. So I've taken this, which you'll see how long it is, and I have made it active, and it's about half as long, and I think much clearer and more direct. Says the exact same thing in half the space and much more effectively. Again, I'm talking about my own writing, so easy for me to say. You can disagree, but I think it's more effective. I mean, this is not compelling text to begin with, but essentially, if this is what you want to communicate, let's do it in an active way. And then the third kind of piece of advice, again, probably not a surprise, is tell more stories. Find ways to weave in story elements. Whether it's telling from a personal perspective, weaving in a user, weaving in a client's quotes, trying to convey emotion. This is music to my ears. Stories make us feel good. This is another third-party research that's confirming that we're wired for stories. It causes our brains to release feel-good hormones. So, I think that we're all people and we're all kind of writing for other people. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that, stories really are time-tested and proven to be effective. Now, this is my final example, this is an example of a no story. It's basically a description of a new project or a project in Kansas City. I won't read it, but you can read it. And it's fine. It's straightforward. There is passive voice in the last sentence, but other than that, okay, it's fine. It's not making me, jump up and down. Now I've rewritten this as a story, with the same facts, about the same length, but in more of a story narrative. And you can read this, and I think it makes it a little bit more engaging, a little more compelling, a little more interesting. So that concludes the formal presentation part of my talk. I would be happy to answer any additional questions or open it up for comments, however you want to handle that. I don't know if there are comments in the chat. I haven't been looking at the chat, but happy to chat further.
Well, I know that or say anything. Thank you, Mike. That was really fun. But one of the comments that I saw in the chat was a question about other tools. You mentioned Power Thesaurus, one you liked to use. Somebody earlier on had given a shout out to Grammarly as being a helpful tool when writing. I don't know if you have anything to add or any comments to make about either of those.
Yeah, I mean, I have used tools like Grammarly, and I think there's one called Hemingway that you can plug your copy in and it comes back with suggestions for making it better. And so I don't use those on a regular basis. I have used them. I think that, it's kind of old school, but I use the thesaurus, primarily as the one. I do use also other humans. I like to run my drafts past other people who either are involved in the project or have no idea what I'm writing about, just to get their feedback. I think that still, even though we've got, with those of you who've been following AI, this Chat GPT, sort of like kind of plug in your directions and they spit out a narrative. And I've tried that. That is certainly interesting in terms of what that potentially will do for writers like me and just writers like you. And it certainly is a place at the current time for first drafts. If you could basically ask it to write a marketing plan about something, write a press release, write whatever, write a proposal. I mean, it's not going to be detailed, but it's going to be quick. It's going to maybe be a place you can start as a first draft. So AI and what's down the road in future iterations of ChatGPT and others will be really fascinating to see what's available, and it's kind of scary on some level in terms of trying to manage, someone who might be able to write about your firm, and share it very, very quickly, and you not necessarily having control over that, etc. So that's a long-winded answer. Any other comments, questions, disagreements?
If somebody doesn't ask one, I'm going to ask all of mine. So get them out.
I have a question. I work for a small residential firm, and so we are often describing the aesthetic value of a space, and words like stunning, beautiful, these can start to feel a little canned. I was wondering if you have any suggestions for making that content feel a bit fresher.
Yeah, I feel your pain and I share it, because that's why I'm constantly, if I'm not looking for a verb, I'm probably looking for an adjective, like you said. And particularly within this industry, everything's stunning, everything's bespoke, and you can get a little cynical and tired of sort of like, okay, aren't there any more words? So I don't have a solution, other than to use a thesaurus and be really, really, thoughtful about when and how you use the adjectives that you do use, so you're not constantly overusing the same ones over and over and over, just because you haven't tried to find others, or you think it makes the project somehow elevates it.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Sandy Kane, I think in response to your question, Katie, threw into the comments, no more pictures, fewer words.
Yeah, I'm a word guy and I'm all in favor of that.
We also have an active disagreement, or no, championship of the Strunk and White elements of style happening in the chat. So didn't expect to see that. That is heartwarming.
Yes, omit needless words. One of my favorite kind of dictates from that.
Well, I have a question for you, Mike. So I think one of the challenges that a lot of us in our marketing roles face is bringing together the writing of maybe about 6 different people and trying to draw together the paragraph on project delivery, the paragraph on quality control, whatever it is, and create a sort of consistency across and reduce redundancy. Do you have any suggestions on the process that can help to on a process that could help to streamline that sometimes onerous work?
Yeah, I mean, the ideal solution, which is not always feasible, is to bring in an outside editor. It doesn't need to be me. It doesn't need to be anyone outside the firm if you've got that expertise inside. I'm assuming you're asking because you don't. You sort of like it's always falling on your lap. And is there a way to streamline the process? And my immediate answer is no. I mean, it's an arduous process. It's an arduous process for someone like me as well sometimes, because some of this stuff is it's so disjointed. It's sort of like you're trying not to change the meaning or the intent of but it's so kind of disjointed that you've got to somehow bring it together. So it sounds like it's coming from the same source. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's probably one of the most challenging things that I do and that writers do.
Mm-hmm. I know that one thing that we've tried to do in my firm is to create an outline, and it's almost like reintroducing the concept of outlining to folks who haven't done it in decades. And that's sometimes helpful to help folks see the big picture so they can stay in their lane, so to speak, and not drift their topic towards other sections.
Yeah, that can work well, I think, for folks who tend to not follow rules.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Lindsay mentions a great resource for punctuation being eats, shoots, and leaves.
Mm-hmm.
The zero tolerance approach to punctuation. That's a fun one.
Yeah, I think it's on the shelf behind me.
I have a quick question about audience, I guess, and discussing like in a proposal or in your about section on a website, the kind of, I think one of the things that is trending right now is being very client focused. So I guess my question is, how do you differentiate between when you should be focusing on yourself as a firm versus your client in a lot of these texts? Because I think like I'm kind of still going back to that one example. But I think one of the things that we get told is you need to focus on the client, you need to focus on the client. What are you giving to the client? So when is it, you know, in an about section on a web page, when is it right to just talk about yourself as opposed to how you help the client?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, my initial reaction is I'm completely in agreement to be more client focused and to talk to your clients and not more about yourself. I mean, I would say start talking, you know, I'm always a fan of, you know, your about section should be straightforward, because when I go to about sections, I don't want to hear some philosophical, some random thing that doesn't really tell me what you do. So I think you need to start, or I would recommend starting with a who, what, when, where, why, who you are as a firm, you know, but I would love to weave in the client perspective, how you help clients, serve clients, empower clients, whatever it is. You know, clients are people and they want to read about themselves, and they want to know that you know, without just saying we're focused on customer service, you know, it's like, show me, what does that mean? How does that, you know, is this a case study? Is this sort of like an anecdote? Is this a quote from a client? You know, there are lots of ways you can do that. It doesn't just have to be in straight narrative, but focusing more on who you're trying to reach and not on who you are. But recognizing you need to start with who you are, because that's primarily what the about section should be about. Anyway, I had another thought, but it left my brain.
That's helpful though. Thank you.
So what I was going to talk about is when I was at HOK, and as you probably know, HOK is a large, very diverse firms that serves many different client types, and clients engage HOK for very different reasons. So a research lab is going to hire HOK for a very different reason than a sports arena, than a corporate campus, you know, than a, you know, jail. So it's like, how do you speak directly to a client, recognizing that a client is not necessarily one mindset or one type of person. It's a challenge. It's a real challenge. I don't have necessarily the solution, but you know, the more diverse your firm is, the more challenging it is. If you're very, very precise on who your target client is, who you serve, I think it's not that difficult to really hone in and speak directly to them. When you're large and diverse and do many things for many types of people, you know, not as easy to do.
Have you seen any website about sections that have really kind of blown you away in a good way?
You know, I haven't, although I've not, candidly, I haven't looked for the good examples, only the bad. So I'm sure they're out there. That may be a helpful exercise to say, hey, and here's someone who actually is doing it well.
Well, that's an aspiration we can all have on our list. Get on Mike's good list.
Yeah, that's right. Naughty and nice, yes.
Anybody else have questions, or, oh, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I will say, you know, when I started working at HOK, my initial observation, and it's only grown stronger over the years, and I think you'll probably agree with me, is like, you as marketers put out such beautiful proposals. They're just wonderful from a visual standpoint. And the writing is like a whole different lower rung in terms of, this is like, these do not match, you know, kind of the design and visual elements of the proposals are like a 10 and the writing is like a 4, and that's probably generous. And it's sort of like there's this just disconnect that, you know, part of my goal is to try to raise the bar on writing, recognizing that your firms are probably not going to bring in teams of writers and hire them, but and don't necessarily have the resources to bring in external writers either. So how do we up the ante and up the skill level of the writing?
We need the technical people coming to these.
Yeah.
Mike, there is a question in the chat from Macy Radloff. I guess there's a lot of background noise where she is, so she's writing her question down. Specifically, writing about projects in a small residential firm. We have several projects that are essentially the same. How do we differentiate the descriptions of these types of projects? How to acknowledge that this is a standard or typical project for us while still highlighting unique qualities of a given project?
Well, my initial thought is, maybe there are two different case studies or project types, where one is sort of talking about the way you're able to have expertise and to sort of extend it across many different projects, which is talking about your efficiency, it's talking about your expertise. So that's kind of one. And then the individual case studies, I think there are probably opportunities to distinguish each of these projects if you tried hard enough. So obviously they're in different locations. They probably had different challenges, perhaps. Maybe there were different challenges throughout the design or construction process that could be highlighted. Maybe you have quotes from the owners, if that makes sense. There's got to be a way to differentiate individual case studies, or why are you writing them?
All right. If there are no other questions or comments, I think we should all go back to our desks and beat ChatGPT to the next about section we're about to write. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I feel like I went to the chiropractor and had an adjustment, but it was for grammar. And I've been reminded of all the things I should know, but kind of lose track of in my day-to-day. So this has been a really good refocus. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike.
My pleasure. I hope it was helpful. And yeah, I look forward to seeing the wonderful prose that all of you are going to put together, and feel free to reach out if you have questions. Happy to engage with you offline, questions, ideas, etc. And keep doing what you're doing, because I know you're, as I said in the early slide, you do a lot of things for a lot of people, but your work matters and you matter, and keep doing it.
Keep on keeping on. And thank you to everybody who attended and shared thoughts about the bad writing we saw, and shared questions that you have. Your questions are my questions. I'm sure that's common for a lot of us. So it's glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear them and to see the answers. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.